This episode is brought to you by the National History Club. When I was growing up, I studied history as much as I could, but when I went to high school and I tried to join different clubs, I couldn't find a single history club. There were clubs on academics, on surfing, on dancing, clubs on cleaning up the environment, but nothing about history. Well, it happens to be the case that right after I graduated, the National History Club was formed. And these guys basically promote history and help start history clubs in different high schools all throughout the country. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check out their website at www.nationalhistoryclub.org. These guys are all over the country. There are 600 schools and 17,000 students involved with this. So be sure to check it out at www.nationalhistoryclub.org. Again, that's www.nationalhistoryclub.org. And now for part 2 of Will and Ted's Imperial Adventure. In our previous episode, we covered America's rise to power in the late 19th century, the temptations posed by imperialism, and finally, how the situation in Cuba led to war with Spain. And we looked at these events through the lens of two men with slightly different views of the situation, American President William McKinley and Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. Despite McKinley's best efforts, America was now at war. The real work was about to begin, and America would face even greater temptations than ever before. How McKinley and Roosevelt responded to these events is the subject of this episode of This American President. As we covered in Part 1, Roosevelt, acting in the place of Secretary Long, ordered Commodore George Dewey, commander of the Asiatic Fleet, to Hong Kong and to prepare for, quote, offensive operations in the Philippine Islands. Although the events in Cuba had caused the war, Roosevelt and the American Navy were focusing elsewhere. Sometimes when wars begin, there is a lull between the declaration of war and the first battle. It can last weeks or months. With this war, the Spanish-American War, this was not the case. American attention focused on Spain's colony in Asia, the archipelago of islands known as the Philippines. Over 350 years earlier, they were named after the Spanish King Philip II. Since that time, they had been ruled by the Spanish, who helped to bring political unity to the fragmented islands. They brought trade, hospitals, education, and the Catholic faith. But the Spanish also ruled with an iron fist, suppressing indigenous revolts while staving off external threats from Chinese and Japanese pirates, Europeans, and the Muslims of Southeast Asia. Just like in Cuba, revolutionary elements emerged in the late 19th century in the Philippines, and just like in Cuba, the Spanish brutally suppressed them. Those who criticized Spanish rule and had called for reform were imprisoned and or executed. Many Filipinos fled Spanish persecution for foreign lands and found themselves supporting an anti-colonial movement while they were abroad. By the 1890s, Spain's heavy-handed rule convinced many Filipinos that there was no alternative beyond declaring independence. A group emerged to lead the independence movement, named Katipunan, which translates to, quote, association, and had the unfortunate acronym KKK. Its leader was a man named André Bonifacio. In August of 1896, the Spanish government discovered the existence of Katipunan. This led Bonifacio to call for a nationwide armed rebellion against Spain. Violence broke out across the Philippine Islands. Filipinos took up arms against their colonial oppressors. Soon, the Philippine Revolution was in full swing. Unfortunately for the rebels, over the next couple of years, they became divided, and Bonifacio fell from grace. He was soon executed by his enemies. A new leader emerged, a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. By December 1897, the revolution was a stalemate, and the rebels, realizing their predicament, signed a truce with the Spanish government. The Philippine Islands were Spain's biggest colonial possession in Asia and a gateway to trade in the region. And they were also where the Spanish stationed its fleet. They wanted to end the rebellion, so they granted the revolutionaries like Aguinaldo amnesty on the condition that they went into exile in Hong Kong. The rebels agreed, but they had a few tricks left up their sleeve. They had no intention of giving up their hopes for an independent nation. While the Filipino rebels were abroad, they planned to obtain more weapons and return to the islands to restart the revolution. And that's where things stood in the Philippines by the time the United States and Spain were at war. The Filipinos were biding their time, waiting patiently to build up their arsenal and planning to resume their revolution. Meanwhile, Spain readied for war. Spain's armada was not what it had been centuries before, but it was still somewhat of a sea power. To many Americans, this posed as a threat to its coasts. And Spain had a big weakness. It centered its Pacific fleet in just one place. If the United States could attack and defeat the fleet in the Philippines, it could eliminate Spain's presence in the Pacific, isolating its forces everywhere else, especially Cuba. On April 27th, 2 days after the United States declared war, America's Asiatic Squadron left Hong Kong towards Manila Bay. On board the USS Olympia was the squadron's commander, Commodore George Dewey. The 60-year-old Dewey had had a long career of service in the Navy. He even saw action all the way back during the Civil War when he was in his 20s. At one point, he had commanded the famous ship, the USS Constitution, also known as Old Ironsides, which saw action during the American Revolution more than 100 years earlier. Anyways, on April 30th, Dewey entered Manila Bay with 4 cruisers, 2 gunboats, 2 transport ships, and 1 cutter. Facing Dewey's squadron was the Spanish fleet, consisting of 7 cruisers, 5 gunboats, and a series of shore defenses. And there, both sides waited, staring at each other. Things remained tense for hours, until the morning of May 1st, when the Spanish began attacking Dewey's fleet. In response, Dewey uttered to his subordinate, Captain Charles Vernon Gridley, the legendary words, quote, "You may fire when ready." With that, the American ships fired at the Spanish. The battle was on. If you're looking for an epic clash between 2 giants, this isn't the place. This isn't Actium or Trafalgar. Very quickly, it became clear that the Spanish couldn't compete. American guns pulverized the Spanish ships. Meanwhile, Spanish coastal defenses didn't even have the range to hit the American ships. Realizing the futility of their guns, the Spanish then sought to ram the American ships, but American guns counterattacked and disabled the Spanish ships. After a lull in the fighting, Americans continued to fire, destroying the Spanish fleet and its coastal defenses. By 1240, about 7 hours after the start of the battle, the Spanish surrendered. Within hours, Spain's Pacific fleet was virtually eliminated. The Battle of Manila Bay remains one of the most decisive naval battles in all of history. It was really a joke. The official tally showed 77 Spanish dead and 271 men wounded. The United States lost just 1 man, due either to heart attack or heat stroke, and had 9 wounded. Only one of its cruisers suffered any form of damage. The Spanish, in comparison, lost 7 cruisers. It was the first battle of the war, but already the United States had single-handedly ended the Spanish maritime presence in Asia. For the American people, the victory against a longtime European power was exhilarating. National pride swelled throughout the country. One senator said of the battle that it was, quote, unequaled in the annals of naval warfare. William Randolph Hearst proclaimed in his usual fashion that, quote, the right is with us and God is with the right. George Dewey became a national hero and would soon be promoted to the rank of Admiral of the Navy, a rank that no American has ever held before or since. Self-proclaimed Jingos couldn't have been more pleased. On the other side, the war couldn't have started off worse for the Spanish. The United States struck a blow, not merely in Cuba, but in the Philippines, its most prized possession in one of the most lucrative regions in the world. It was a signal that the United States was not confining its ambitions to Cuba, but against the entire Spanish Empire. It was also a message to the world that America had muscles to flex. As these events played out, one man in particular couldn't stand sitting still. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to play a role in the war, but not from the confines of a government office. There's a great story about Roosevelt that encapsulates his feelings at this time, and it comes from his boss, Secretary Long. Back in January, Long wrote in his diary that Roosevelt, quote, told me, in case of war with Spain, he intends to abandon everything and go to the front. The impetuosity and fierceness with which Roosevelt insists upon this are rather amusing. He has gone so far daft in the matter that he evidently regards it as a sacred duty which he owes to his own character, to improve every opportunity of dying with malaria, or being played out with a hospital fever in this bushwhacking fight in Cuba. I tried to persuade him that if it was his country which was at stake, or his home should be defended, such a course would be worthwhile. I called him a crank, and ridiculed him to the best of ability, but all in vain. The funny part of it is that he actually takes the thing seriously. It's funny to imagine an American bureaucrat acting like this today. Can you picture some Undersecretary of Defense in a suit planning to enlist in the Army to be the first guy on the front? But this was Theodore Roosevelt. By this time, he was 39 years old. He had spent years talking and writing about the glories of war, how countries and societies benefit from war. He was born too young to serve in the Civil War, and up until then, never had a chance to serve in a major war. And he was someone who, on his own, had overcome asthma and lived what he described to be the strenuous life. He was the New York aristocrat that became a Dakota sheriff. You can tell from this quote that some people didn't know what to make of Roosevelt, including his own boss, Secretary Long. But to Roosevelt, those people didn't matter. He was not going to let this opportunity slip by, and no one was going to stand in his way. So, on May 6th, Roosevelt resigned his post at the Navy and announced his intention to fight in Cuba. He did so despite the fact that his wife and one of his sons were in poor health and had asked him to stay at home. But sorry, wife, this was war. Roosevelt and his friend, Army Colonel Leonard Wood, soon brought together a motley crew from all parts of the country. They came from New England, New York, Texas, Oklahoma, and the American Southwest. One observer described them as, quote, millionaires, paupers, shyster lawyers, cowboys, quack doctors, farmers, college professors, miners, adventurers, preachers, prospectors, socialists, journalists, insurance agents, Jews, politicians, Gentiles, Mexicans, professed Christians, Indians, West Point graduates, Arkansas wild men, baseball players, sheriffs, and horse thieves. Some of them had careers in law enforcement or in the military, had retired and were itching to get into action, so they weren't without experience. Their official name was the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. They would be known to history as the Rough Riders. Wood was appointed to be the colonel of the Rough Riders, while Roosevelt was second in command as assistant colonel. There was also another reason, a more private reason, that Roosevelt was going to the front, and it had to do with his father, Theodore Sr. The younger Roosevelt had written that his father, quote, was the best man I ever knew, who, quote, combined strength and courage with gentleness, tenderness, and great unselfishness. While he admired his father for his whole life, there's one thing that he couldn't quite come to terms with. During the Civil War, his father stayed out of the fighting by hiring someone to serve in his place. This was something both legal and commonplace at the time, and historians speculate that Theodore Sr. did it because his wife's family were Southerners and supportive of the Confederate cause. He may have wanted to maintain harmony in the family. But for Theodore Jr., it was a source of lifelong regret. After all, he was known throughout the country as a supporter of the war, and of war in general. The fact that his father avoided the war made the Roosevelt family look to some like hypocrites. For him, fighting in Cuba would go a long way to show that the Roosevelts practice what they preach. Roosevelt later said, quote, "A man's usefulness depends upon his living up to his ideals insofar as he can. Now, I have consistently preached what our opponents are pleased to call jingo doctrines for a good many years. One of the commonest taunts directed at men like myself is that we are armchair and parlor jingos who wish to see others do what we only advocate doing. When the chance came for me to go to Cuba with the Rough Riders, Mrs. Roosevelt was very ill, and so was Teddy. It was a question if either would ultimately get well, yet I made up my mind that I would not allow even a death to stand in my way, that it was my one chance to cut my little notch on the stick that stands as the measuring rod in every family. I know now that I would have turned from my wife's deathbed to have answered that call. I loathe war. When I went to Cuba, I left 6 children behind. In the night before each fight, I never dared to think of either my wife or my children because it really tended to unman me. I would be ashamed of my sons if they shirked war, just as I should be ashamed of my daughters if they shirked motherhood. By fighting, Theodore Roosevelt was hoping to live out his highest ideals and to answer his critics. But it was also a brilliant career move. He already had many achievements under his belt. But to historian, rancher, and public servant, he hoped to add the title of war hero. And if he could do that, who knew how much higher he could go? The whole thing still seemed a bit ridiculous to Roosevelt's former boss, Secretary Long, who said, quote, "He has lost his head to this unutterable folly of deserting his post, where he is of most service, and running off to ride a horse, and probably brush mosquitoes off his neck on the Florida sands. His heart is right, and he means well, but it is one of those cases of aberration, desertion, vainglory, of which he is utterly unaware. He thinks he is following his highest ideals, whereas, in fact, as without exception, every one of his friends advises him he is acting like a fool. And yet, how absurd this will sound if, by some turn of fortune, he should accomplish some great thing." The victory at Manila Bay was so lopsided and so early in the war that it raised questions that Americans, including the biggest supporters of the war, hadn't even considered. The Spanish fleet in the Philippines was gone, but its colonial government was still there in the capital, Manila. There were still Spanish officials in charge there. Meanwhile, the Filipino rebels were still planning to resume their revolution. Henry Cabot Lodge, supporter of the war, wrote, quote, "The victory at Manila was at first so overwhelming I did not take in all its possibilities." Soon, however, it became clear to Lodge and many Americans that the Philippines represented an opportunity to create an American empire. In our last episode, we talked about the declaration of war against Spain, about how it featured the Teller Amendment, which prohibited America taking over Cuba. The intent, which reflected the sentiment of anti-imperialists, was to keep the war aims from becoming one of American conquest. But it didn't say anything about the Philippines. Now that the Americans had defeated the Spanish in Manila, they were in possession of the bay. It might not take much to take over the capital city. And if you could get Manila, the capital, the rest of the islands might fall into American control. And why not? The islands could be a lucrative possession. After all, they were a gateway to East Asia and the Southeast Asia trade. They could help America to compete with the European powers that had already established spheres of influence in China. Of course, none of this took into account the desires of the Filipinos. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge had resolved, quote, "We must on no account let the islands go. We must hold the other side of the Pacific, and the value to this country is almost beyond imagination." But many were skeptical, the most important among them being President McKinley. First of all, Dewey didn't seem to even have enough men to invade the island and remove the existing Spanish government. Secondly, McKinley just didn't know much about the Philippines. Most people didn't. He was said to have remarked, quote, "I could not have told you where those darned islands were within 1,000 miles. Were we ready to acquire a series of islands halfway around the world that we knew little about? There were many unanswered questions. McKinley wasn't ready to act on the Philippines yet, but he was getting advice from different corners. And according to author Stephen Kinzer, Lodge began meeting with President McKinley personally with the hope of changing his mind. On May 19, 1898, General Emilio Aguinaldo, the top Filipino rebel leader who had been in exile, arrived at the Philippines in the province of Cavite, just south of Manila Bay. Weeks earlier, just before the Battle of Manila Bay, he had met with 2 American officials in Singapore. According to Aguinaldo, he was told that General Dewey would promise American recognition of Philippine independence and a trip back to the islands if he would resume his revolution against the Spanish. There was nothing written on paper, but Aguinaldo believed the offer to be legitimate. Aguinaldo soon met with Dewey aboard the USS Olympia. In his words, quote, "The admiral ushered me into his private quarters, and after the exchange of the usual greetings, replied that the United States had come to the Philippines to protect the natives and free them of the yoke of Spain." He said, moreover, that America is exceedingly well off as regards territory, revenue, and resources, and therefore needs no colonies, assuring me finally that there was no occasion for me to entertain any doubts whatever about the recognition of the independence of the Philippines by the United States. Then Admiral Dewey asked me if I could induce the people to rise against the Spaniards and make a short, sharp, and decisive campaign of it. I said in reply that events would speak for themselves. The admiral said, as he had already indicated, the United States would unquestionably recognize the independence of the people of the Philippines, guaranteed as it was by the word of honor of Americans, which, he said, is more positive, more irrevocable than any written agreement. According to Aguinaldo, Dewey himself had personally promised him American support for Philippine independence. Commodore Dewey, in his autobiography, has a different account. Quote, "From my observation of Aguinaldo and his advisers, I decided that it would be unwise to cooperate with him or his adherents in any official matter. Aside from permitting him to establish himself ashore, the only aid rendered him was a gift of some Mauser rifles and an old smoothbore gun that had been abandoned by the Spanish. In short, my policy was to avoid any entangling alliance with the insurgents, while I appreciated that, pending the arrival of our troops, they might be of service in clearing the long neck of land that stretches out from Cavite Peninsula to the environs of Manila." Dewey's account made no mention of any promise for Philippine independence. McKinley himself had written to Dewey, quote, "It is desirable, as far as possible, not to have political alliances with any insurgents or any factions in the island that would incur our liability to maintain their cause in the future." Now, this discrepancy lies at the heart of a historical question that remains unresolved to this day. Did American officials make this promise? Those who believe that it did interpret subsequent events as a betrayal of the Philippine people, an indictment against the United States, a nation that feigned belief in the principles of democracy while employing means of deception to expand its own empire. At this point, President McKinley began preparing for some type of occupation of the islands. He started boosting America's military presence on the islands. Just after the Battle of Manila, McKinley sent 5,000 ground forces to the Philippines with instructions that alluded ambiguously to, quote, "such service as may be ordered hereafter." On May 1st, that number was 10,000. By May 29th, it was almost 30,000. The man chosen to lead this effort was 61-year-old General Wesley Merritt, who, like Dewey, had served in the Civil War and was once superintendent of West Point. McKinley provided Merritt with broad authority to establish military governance over the islands, which included establishing a legal system and raising taxes. The president also ordered Merritt to complete, quote, "the reduction of Spanish power and of giving order and security to the islands while in possession of the United States." These decisions took America to a place it hadn't anticipated, the occupation of a foreign land. But if you think that settled the issue for McKinley, it didn't. He hadn't decided yet on whether the Americans were there to stay. Some of those who saw him during this time said he favored, quote, "the general principle of holding on to what we get." But to Lodge, he said he hoped that the Philippine insurgents, quote, "will develop enough strength to solve the problem by setting up a government of their own under our protection." He also questioned whether the Philippines was suitable for American occupation, given its intense tropical climate and the differences between the two cultures. And even after McKinley increased troop levels in the Philippines, by early June he was still hoping to make peace with Spain. At that time, he was still considering letting Spain keep the Philippines as long as they accepted Cuban independence. While McKinley brooded over his choice, he may not have realized that by sending thousands of forces to Manila, he was already setting in motion an uncontrollable chain of events. Almost every account I've read about these events and decisions explain them away as a simple case of American greed, arrogance, or duplicity. Is this the case? Well, the issue of whether or not Dewey promised Aguinaldo Philippine independence comes down to one man's word against the other. And motives are always hard to discern, especially among historical figures. There were certainly imperialists in Washington who hoped to create and expand an American empire, Lodge and Roosevelt being among them. But McKinley's actions indicate that he was at least a little more cautious, maybe even ambivalent. And those who believe that McKinley was manipulated by business interests ignore that not all the American business community was behind the war. It also ignores that most accounts portray McKinley as in charge of his cabinet and his government. There's perhaps another reason. It's a reason that some people scoff at, but I think it's worth mentioning. In the aftermath of the Battle of Manila Bay, Japan, Germany, Britain, and France maintained a naval presence in Manila Harbor. Historian Priscilla Roberts has written that Japan indicated, quote, its willingness to take over the Philippine Islands should the United States be reluctant to annex the archipelago. Historian Lewis Gould wrote that U.S. Ambassador John Hay and other State Department officials reported that Germany had ambitions in the Philippines as well. For many anti-imperialists, the choice was between keeping alive the dream of the founders and America as a republic, not making it an empire. Imperialists, on the other hand, thought that that was incredibly naive. This was a dangerous world. If we didn't acquire the Philippines, someone else would. For them, the choice was expanding the influence of the American Republic or surrendering that influence to non-republics. To them, surrendering the Philippines was not the Republican thing to do, because it would only allow European empires or the nascent Japanese empire to fill in the void. If the United States didn't take over the islands with all its wealth and access to Asian trade, someone else would. Wouldn't it be better for the world and for the Philippines, they asked, if the world's mightiest republican nation, rather than other more imperialistic powers, expanded its influence? The same went for Cuba. As Teddy Roosevelt put it, quote, if we fail to take Cuba, it will remain in the hands of a weak and decadent nation, and the chance to take it will be just as good as ever. In his eyes, imperialism was not the forbidden fruit, but the necessary duty of a world power. It's easy for people to scoff at this line of reasoning. Many also like to point out how self-serving this logic appears. Some asked, why was America so sure that its influence was necessarily the best influence? But if you genuinely believed in the American experiment, in the values that its citizens consider universal, it's not a stretch to see why many believed in this, especially in a time when Europe and Japan were scrambling for colonies. However you might feel about this, it reflected the dilemmas that America faced as it became a world power, dilemmas that we continue to face to this day. Of course, there were Americans who believed, regardless of what other nations did, that their country should still shun the temptation to acquire territory abroad. By June, these anti-imperialists began speaking out. Some argued that America's quest to liberate peoples abroad, specifically the Cuban peoples, was an act of national hypocrisy. Why were we so concerned about the suffering of people in other countries when we were so unconcerned about the suffering of people at home, namely African Americans who were suffering from a virtual system of apartheid in the South due to Jim Crow laws? Progressive activist Bolton Hall made the point, quote, the cruelty exhibited in Cuba is no peculiarity of the Spanish race. Within the last few weeks, instances of cruelty to Negroes have occurred in this country which equal, if they do not surpass, anything which has occurred in Cuba. Our crusade in this matter should begin at home. We see every day the vast injustices prevailing in our own land, the hopeless toil, the wretched poverty, the armies of unemployed, and until we remove these beams from our own eyes, we should not presume to take the mote from our brothers. With these words, Hall employed an argument that many Americans would, throughout the 20th century, take to its logical extreme, that America was no better than any other nation, and, as a result, had no right to liberate peoples or impose its values abroad, or that it simply had enough problems at home and couldn't afford to make new ones abroad. And one can't fault Hall for making this argument. Jim Crow was a real and shameful thing. But Hall's argument was more the exception than the rule. As I studied the anti-war movement during the Spanish-American War, I was struck at just how pro-American most of it was. Anti-imperialists appealed to American values and argued that, contrary to Bolton Hall, America was too good for conquest. These anti-war activists cited the Founding Fathers, like George Washington, and praised America's behavior up until then as one of devotion to liberty. In the words of Carl Schurz, a staunch anti-imperialist, quote, "We are told that as we have grown very rich and very powerful, the principles of policy embodied in Washington's farewell address have become obsolete, that we have new responsibilities and new duties, a particular mission. When we ask what these new responsibilities and duties require this republic to do, the answer is that it should meddle more than heretofore with the concerns of the outside world for the purposes of furthering the progress of civilization, that it must adopt an imperial policy and make a beginning by keeping as American possessions the island colonies conquered from Spain. What then will follow if the United States commit this breach of faith? What could our answer be if the world should say of the American people that they are wolves in sheep's clothing, rapacious land grabbers posing as unselfish champions of freedom and humanity, false pretenders who have proved the truth of all that has been said by their detractors as to their hypocrisy and greed, and whose word can never again be trusted? And how will that cause of civilization fare which consists in the credit of democratic institutions, of the government of, by, and for the people, for which the American people are above all things responsible, and the maintenance of which above all things is their duty and mission? Will not those appear right who say that democratic government is not only no guarantee of peace, but that it is capable of the worst kind of war, the war of conquest, and of resorting to that kind of war, too, as a hypocrite and false pretender? Such a loss of character, in itself a most deplorable moral calamity, would be followed by political consequences of a very serious nature. Another anti-imperialist, Senator George Hoar, said, quote, "I believe that the highest service the American people can render to mankind and to liberty is to preserve unstained and unchanged the Republic. The danger is that we are to be transformed from a republic founded on the Declaration of Independence, guided by the counsels of Washington, the hope of the poor, the refuge of the oppressed, into a vulgar, commonplace empire founded upon physical force, controlling subject races and vassal states." It's interesting to me to read anti-war speeches from that time appeal to what many today would call conservative American values. In their speeches, Schurz and Hoar discussed how American founding ideals, in their mind, discouraged American intervention abroad. They criticized those who believed that America had progressed from the founding era and therefore believed that our principles must change with the times, and who used this logic to justify imperialism. According to Schurz and Hoar, that kind of logic, that progressive logic, was responsible for American aggression abroad. Back then, many who were considered progressive were also supporters of imperialism, like Roosevelt and Lodge, while those who were considered conservative were often against it, like Grover Cleveland. In an interesting turnaround in the present day, those who argue for that progressive philosophy are usually those who lament what they call American imperialism. The anti-war movement in America grew to encompass a large section of the American people, and it included an impressive list of prominent citizens, a fact that made it impossible to consider it merely a fringe movement. Men like former President Cleveland and Mark Twain opposed the war and appealed to America's founding principles. And the anti-war movement crossed political ideology and political party lines. It counted capitalists like Andrew Carnegie and populists like William Jennings Bryan. The cast of anti-imperialists may have been impressive, but they weren't in the driver's seat. William McKinley was. In some places he hesitated, like in the Philippines, but in other places he acted decisively. And as we will see, he did so in favor of the imperialists. He seized on unexpected opportunities. Guam, another Spanish colony, was on the way to the Philippines. Like Hawaii and the Philippines, it was a gateway to East Asian trade and a potentially valuable military base. Orders were sent to Captain Henry Glass of the USS Charleston to take Guam, using, quote, such force as may be necessary to capture the port of Guam, making prisoners of the governor and other officials and any armed force that may be there. On June 20th, the Charleston arrived on the island. The next day, the Spanish government surrendered without a fight. In doing so, Captain Henry Glass, according to historian Stephen Kinzer, was the first American officer to ever successfully seize an overseas territory for the United States. America then turned its focus to yet another Spanish territory, Puerto Rico. Under General Miles, American troops landed on the island on July 25, 1898. Senator Lodge's son, George, participated in the invasion. The Spanish had recently granted autonomy to Puerto Rico, but none of this mattered. The government soon surrendered to the Americans there as well. George Lodge had the honor of receiving the surrender. Meanwhile, McKinley's effort to annex Hawaii, covered in the last episode, had stalled. To Theodore Roosevelt, the annexation of Hawaii was a no-brainer. In his words, quote, Hawaii is of more pressing and immediate importance than Cuba. If we don't take Hawaii, it will pass into the hands of some strong nation, and the chance of our taking it will be gone forever. I am fully alive to the danger of Japan, and I know that it is idle to rely on any sentimental goodwill towards us. But there was a big obstacle to annexing Hawaii. It took two-thirds support in the Senate to ratify a treaty. But there was enough anti-imperialist sentiment to prevent that from happening. It looked like the annexationists were stuck. But Lodge and his fellow imperialists found a way out, and it harkened back to something we covered in our 10th and 11th episodes, the ones on the Mexican-American War. During that time, America desired to annex Texas, but since it was a slave state, there was a great deal of opposition from the northern states to get it done. It was impossible to obtain the two-thirds of the Senate to ratify the treaty, so instead the annexationists decided to skip the entire treaty ratification process. Instead, they decided to simply pass a resolution of annexation, which only needed a majority. It worked, and Texas joined the Union. Lodge and his men decided to recreate this maneuver to annex Hawaii. It worked. In the middle of June, the House passed a resolution. The following month, the Senate passed it. On July 7, 1898, President McKinley signed it. By August 12, 1898, Hawaii was officially a part of the United States. Just 3.5 months after war was declared, America had acquired 3 new territories and was posed to invade 2 more. For former President Cleveland, it was a bitter blow. As president, the conservative Cleveland had opposed annexing Hawaii, but now his work had been undone. In a letter to a friend, Cleveland wrote, quote, Hawaii is ours. As I look back upon the first steps in this miserable business, and as I contemplate the means used to complete the outrage, I am ashamed of the whole affair. Imperialists were giddy at America's new acquisitions, but the biggest reason America entered the war was Cuba. Cuba posed more of a challenge because there was a formidable Spanish force, about 80,000 men. When the war started, back in late April, McKinley ordered that the U.S. Navy blockade the island and sent General William Shafter down to the city of Santiago, the island's second-largest city, to work with the insurgents and attack the Spanish colonial government. By June, the American army sailed towards Santiago, Cuba. This included Theodore Roosevelt and his motley crew of volunteer Rough Riders. Roosevelt could barely contain his excitement, like a kid in a candy shop. For him, it was a chance at personal vindication. But it was also more than that. For him, it was something even bigger, the chance for his country to make its mark on the world. He wrote, quote, It is a great historical expedition, and I thrill to think I am part of it. If we are allowed to succeed, for certainly we will succeed if allowed, we will have scored the first great triumph in what will be a world movement. On June 23, 1898, Roosevelt and his men landed in Daiquiri, Cuba, near Santiago. Initially, Roosevelt ranked second in rank for the Rough Riders, but when his superior, Leonard Wood, was promoted to command a brigade, Roosevelt officially took the top spot. He was also promoted to the rank of colonel. The entire American force on the island, called the Fifth Army Corps, was divided into 3 divisions. The Rough Riders, all volunteers, were part of a larger cavalry division of regular soldiers commanded by former Confederate General Joseph Wheeler. On June 24th, the Americans participated in a brief skirmish known as the Battle of Los Gosimas. But that was merely an interlude to what was about to come next. On July 1st, the Americans, totaling several thousand men, faced the Spanish just outside of Santiago. The engagement that day would be known as the Battle of San Juan Hill. Spanish General Arsenio Linares y Pombo placed about 750 men to defend the hills around Santiago. He also had over 10,000 men in and around of Santiago itself. Historians still debate as to why he didn't use more of those men to augment the 750 men defending the heights. Despite this oversight and the fact that the Spanish were in decline as an empire, their soldiers were still impressive and were hardened after years of fighting Cuban insurgents. They were also well equipped with artillery and 7mm Mauser rifles. On the other hand, the Americans had less effective artillery, but they did have Krag rifles and Gatling machine guns. They also had the help of about 3,000 Cuban insurgents, blocking further Spanish reinforcements. The fighting began with the Spanish firing their Mausers. That and the tropical heat ravaged the Americans. One of 3 American divisions was sent to attack the nearby town El Caney, and soon found itself facing heavy fire. That left 2 other divisions to focus on the main targets, San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. Possession of these 2 targets would mean a path to Santiago. At San Juan Hill, the American infantry began firing their Gatling guns at the Spanish. The Gatlings were highly effective and mowed down Spanish soldiers. Eventually, the Spanish were forced to flee and abandon San Juan to the Americans. Meanwhile, the cavalry division was engaged in a fierce fight for Kettle Hill. It included 2 regular Army cavalry regiments, including an African American regiment, and Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. The regular regiments went first, while Roosevelt awaited orders. Spanish fire poured down on the regulars, cutting them down. American bodies piled up, while the rest of them halted and fired back at the Spanish. While all of this was happening, Roosevelt and his men waited and waited for orders, but they never came. As the casualties mounted, Roosevelt refused to stand idly by. He was not a man given to patience. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip by. He mounted his horse and personally led the Rough Riders' charge, without authorization from his superiors. When Roosevelt caught up with one of the regular brigades, he insisted that they rush the Spanish, rather than keep firing. When an officer told Roosevelt that they didn't have the orders to do so, he replied, quote, "I'm the ranking officer here, and I give the order to charge." When the officer remained reluctant, Roosevelt replied, quote, "Then let my men through, sir." Roosevelt began to charge, but he noticed that some of his men weren't following him. Angered, he went back and began taunting his men as cowards. He took out his gun and threatened to shoot anyone who wouldn't charge. The men experienced a sudden change of heart and began advancing with Roosevelt. Around this time, the Americans received a fresh set of Gatling guns and began firing. The Spanish began to fall back. As they retreated, Roosevelt yelled, quote, "Holy Godfrey, what fun!" In the midst of the fighting, 2 bullets grazed Roosevelt, one in the elbow and another in the hand. Thankfully, they were minor injuries. Roosevelt later showed them off as badges of honor. Before long, the Americans commanded Kettle Hill. When Roosevelt reached the heights, he and a colleague encountered 2 remaining Spaniards who jumped out and fired their Mausers. Roosevelt immediately drew out a revolver, which just happened to have been given to him as a gift and was salvaged from the USS Maine. Roosevelt fired and killed one of them. He later would write that he, quote, "shot the man in the left breast as he turned, and not in the back, which might have been called a cowardly act of murder." The Americans had suffered heavy casualties. It was the bloodiest battle of the entire Spanish-American War. The numbers vary as to how many were killed. Some say about 200 for each side. Either way, America now had a path to Santiago. The Spanish were on the ropes, and they knew it. 2 days later, Shafter began a siege of the city, and again used Gatlings against the city's defenders. General Jose Toral y Velázquez, who held Santiago, tried to negotiate with Shafter, but the Americans continued the siege. By July 17th, Toral had surrendered Santiago. The Americans were triumphant. The Battle of San Juan Hill only confirmed what many knew. Spain had no chance against the United States. But something else had happened. A star was born. Theodore Roosevelt was now a national hero. For Roosevelt, it was personal. No one could hold his father's decision to not fight in the Civil War against him or his family. He had proven that he was a man of his word. His opponents may have believed that he was a crazy warmonger, but they couldn't say that he wasn't willing to fight himself, that he was a chicken hawk. There's some irony here. Thousands of regular soldiers served in the battle. Some of them, including black soldiers in the 10th Cavalry, actually saw more intense fighting and paid a higher price. But the press wasn't following them. Roosevelt's Rough Riders, a volunteer regiment, were just a fraction of the total force. But he and his men were the best self-promoters. Americans thrilled to their heroics, at a time when communication was getting easier and when newspapers were at their most sensational. Roosevelt, in particular, was an irresistible subject. But it wasn't just personal for Roosevelt. It was professional. When you study great historical figures, sometimes certain moments happen that foreshadow the future. There are moments that serve notice to the world that something great is about to happen, that someone is about to take the world by storm. And the Battle of San Juan was one of those moments. Roosevelt later called it, quote, the great day of my life. He had proven himself as a writer, an intellectual, a politician, and a reformer. But now Roosevelt added the title of war hero to his belt. He was, after all, the advocate of the strenuous life. Here was a man who had resigned a government job to join the front. He personally led men into battle. He proved that he did not fear death, that his convictions were more than just bluster, that he believed in them so much that he was willing to risk his life. He had staked his entire reputation and his life and came away victorious. He had made the unlikely transformation from a government bureaucrat to a real-life action hero. One of my favorite political cartoons from this era is one by artist Grant Hamilton in the magazine Judge. If you have a chance, you should Google it sometime. It's titled, quote, Is It Only a Shadow? It depicts a bird's-eye view of Washington, D.C., and shows the United States in the background and the U.S. Capitol in the foreground. Standing on the balcony of the Capitol are Republican leaders, including President McKinley. They all have this concerned look on their faces. And the reason is because they see a massive shadow that covers a big part of the White House grounds. The shadow is the unmistakable silhouette of Theodore Roosevelt in his Rough Rider hat and uniform. And it underscored the sense that Theodore Roosevelt was destined for the presidency. Lodge would later write to Roosevelt, quote, I hear talk all the time about your being run for governor and congressman. At this moment, you could have pretty much anything you wanted. Few people were as thrilled as Roosevelt himself. Like a giddy child, he wrote Lodge, quote, Did I tell you that I killed a Spaniard with my own hand when I led the storm of the first redoubt? Probably I did. He basked in the attention and made clear that he believed he deserved it. He began lobbying for the Medal of Honor, writing, quote, I feel that the Medal of Honor is the greatest distinction open to any American. I should be more proud than I can say to have earned it myself. If I didn't earn it, then no commissioned officer ever can earn it. This will seem very egotistical. I am entitled to the Medal of Honor, and I want it. For many imperialists, Roosevelt was a dream candidate. His future was brighter than ever, and he was just 39 years old. But William McKinley was still president, and not even halfway through his first term in office, and he was succeeding beyond the wildest expectations. After all, under his watch, America had secured or was in the process of securing several overseas possessions. The war so far had been a triumph. McKinley was bound to run for re-election in 1900, so the earliest Roosevelt might be able to run was 1904, 6 long years away. The Spanish could see the writing on the wall. They reached out to the French to assist them in talks with the United States. On their behalf, Jules Cambon, the French ambassador to the U.S., visited the White House and met with McKinley on July 30th. McKinley made clear his demands. He demanded that Spain renounce Cuba and Puerto Rico. Since he was still undecided on the future of the Philippines, McKinley offered for the status of the islands to be decided by a peace commission. On August 1st, the Spanish replied that they had still hoped to hold on to Puerto Rico and was willing to trade another possession to keep it. And they also rejected the idea that they had lost the Philippines. This irritated President McKinley, who responded that Spain had lost Puerto Rico forever, but he was still willing to talk about the Philippines. McKinley also feared that Spain was trying to delay talks to buy time. He warned Spain, quote, "All vacillation will further aggravate the severity of the conditions." Talks continued in Paris. On August 12, 1898, just about 10 weeks after it started, a protocol of peace was signed ending hostilities. Although the treaty had yet to be worked out, it was all but over. The United States, under President McKinley, had won an impressive victory against a European power. America's first overseas venture was a smashing success. To many, it signaled a new age, the passing of the torch from one world to another. The McKinley administration basked in triumph. The newly appointed Secretary of State, John Hay, said, quote, "It has been a splendid little war, begun with the highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, favored by that fortune which loves the brave." At the center of it all was President McKinley, whose popularity reached new heights. One publication observed that McKinley, quote, "is now by far the most influential personage in the United States." But the president was utterly exhausted. Around this time, McKinley was quoted saying, quote, "The days merge into each other. The mental and physical strain of the last few months had been severe." But for the next few months, he had to work out the details of the treaty and establish governments in the acquired territories. He sent a peace commission to Paris to negotiate the treaty with Spain. The commission had 5 members, 3 of whom were senators, one of which was from the opposition Democratic Party. It was clear that the United States was going to take over Guam and Puerto Rico. The main questions were about Cuba and Philippines. And remember, the Teller Amendment barred American annexation of Cuba. Also, Cuba had a $400 million debt, and America wanted Spain to assume it. When it came to the Philippines, McKinley was still undecided. When you study him around this time, you find he seems genuinely torn about what to do. At one point, he considered just taking over Manila and giving the rest back to the Filipinos. During this time, McKinley received a series of messages that began to convince him to take over the Philippines. Remember earlier what I had said about Germany being the rising power in Europe? Well, in May, McKinley heard from Ambassadors John Hay and Andrew White rumors that Germany was interested in taking over the Philippines. In early June, Germany's Navy traveled to Manila Bay to observe American naval tactics. In July, Admiral Dewey sent a telegraph stating that Germany was interfering with the insurgents in the Philippines. McKinley also began hearing that Japan might fill in the void in case the United States left. The status of the Philippines was in limbo, not just diplomatically, but militarily. During the war, Aguinaldo believed that he had the backing of the United States for Philippine independence. When he returned to the Philippines, he began consolidating insurgent forces to fight the Spanish government and amassed a force of about 11,000 men. Back on July 12th, Aguinaldo declared the independence of the Philippine Islands. On July 18th, Aguinaldo issued a formal decree establishing a Philippine government with himself as dictator. 5 days later, on June 23rd, Aguinaldo issued another decree, this time replacing the dictatorship with a revolutionary government, with himself as president. The Americans under General Merritt and Aguinaldo's men worked together to defeat the remaining Spanish forces on the island. By August 13, 1898, the Philippines was liberated from Spain. The Philippines were under the impression the United States would recognize their independence, but the Americans had actually plotted with the Spanish during the last battle to ensure that control of Manila went to them, the Americans, and not the Filipinos. Also, the Americans in Manila were careful not to appear to be working too closely with the Filipinos. Admiral Dewey informed McKinley that, quote, "The United States has not been bound in any way to assist insurgents by any act or promises, that he being Aguinaldo, is not, to my knowledge, committed to assist us." Debate raged in Washington and across the nation about what to do with the Philippines, and it involved the usual arguments surrounding imperialism, with imperialists arguing that it was the duty to civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, and that not taking it over would be surrendering it to another colonial power. Anti-imperialists argue that the Filipinos clearly wanted self-rule. Ironically, at this time, the Filipino rebels themselves were divided over whether they wanted to be independent and whether or not they wanted to become an American territory, like a protectorate. After all, the Filipinos were outmatched against the Americans, and they weren't sure they wanted to undertake another war against a rising world power. Meanwhile, things were getting tense between American and Philippine forces in Manila. A new general, Elwell Otis, arrived in Manila in late August to replace General Merritt as the top American commander there. General Otis immediately ordered Aguinaldo to withdraw from Manila. Aguinaldo, knowing he was outmatched, complied. In late September, McKinley met with Major General Francis V. Greene, who had been in the Philippines throughout the war. He told McKinley that Aguinaldo's government was, quote, a dictatorship of the familiar South American type, that it was unstable and didn't have the support of the Philippine population. General Greene insisted that the Filipinos preferred, quote, a republic under American protection, such as they have heard is to be granted to Cuba, and that they believed, quote, no native government can maintain itself without the active support and the protection of a strong foreign government. It's very possible that this is what finally convinced McKinley. It was a fateful decision. In late October, McKinley had made his mind. The United States would demand all of the Philippines from Spain. He set instructions to commissioners on October 28th, saying, quote, grave as are the responsibilities and unforeseen as are the difficulties which are before us, the President can see but one plain path of duty, the acceptance of the archipelago. The people of the Philippines, whatever else is done, must be liberated from Spanish domination. He insisted that he was motivated, quote, by the single consideration of duty and humanity. There is an interesting story that came out a few years later that may give a clear picture of McKinley's thinking. It came from a general named James F. Russling, who apparently met the president a year later on November 21st, 1899 at the White House. According to Russling, McKinley was meeting with a delegation of Methodist church leaders when he said the following, quote, before you go, I would like to say just a word about the Philippine business. I've been criticized a good deal about the Philippines, but don't deserve it. The truth is, I didn't want the Philippines, and when they came to us as a gift from the gods, I did not know what to do with them. I sought counsel from all sides, Democrats as well as Republicans, but got little help. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight. But I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came, that we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. That we could not turn them over to France and Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. That we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government. That they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was. And that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. Some historians dispute Russling's account, saying that he embellished McKinley's words, that he may have added religious flourish to the story. Other historians accept it as accurate. There is evidence that McKinley saw the takeover of the Philippines as a religious duty. Around the same time, the president told a German-American editor, quote, Providence had made us guardians of the group of islands. If true, it shows us a few things. That McKinley believed that Europe was threatening to take over the islands, a motivation for joining the Imperial bandwagon, but also believed that the Philippines were not ready for self-rule, and that he had a humanitarian and a moral obligation to teach them the ways of civilization. Depending on where you sit, we can allow that McKinley was well-meaning, although his critics continue to see his motives through the lens of Western paternalism and its sense of superiority. As the war was ending, imperialists sensed a chance to boost their political strength. It was an election year, and their beloved hero Theodore Roosevelt was being considered for high office. The former bureaucrat turned war hero had his sights on one of the most powerful positions in the country, governor of New York. New York was the most populous state in the Union, and to some, its governor was the most powerful American politician after the president himself. Just 16 years earlier, Grover Cleveland had used the position as a stepping stone to the White House, so many knew that if Roosevelt was elected to Albany, that he would be well positioned to run for the presidency. Anti-imperialist Carl Schurz was quoted to say, "Election to the governorship of New York, as it repeatedly has been said, may become, in Colonel Roosevelt's case, the stepping stone to a nomination for the presidency. Indeed, it is in everyone's mouth that if Colonel Roosevelt succeeds, it will be so." The only problem was that a Republican, Frank S. Black, was already governor of New York, and in his first term. Most people assumed he would run for re-election. Roosevelt was already frozen out of running for president in 1900 and might even be frozen out of running for governor in 1898. And as a reformer, Roosevelt was a threat to the party bosses of New York. There would be powerful and entrenched interests stacked against him. But Roosevelt was a man of destiny. Fate would intervene, and the stars would align for him. It turned out that Governor Black's administration got bogged down in scandal. Republicans were now tainted, and they feared losing the state's governorship to the Democrats. The party bosses, including Tom Platt, realized that the only way of keeping the New York governor's seat was to run a popular reformer with bipartisan appeal. Enter Theodore Roosevelt. With the support of the party bosses, Roosevelt got the nomination to succeed Governor Black. That fall, Roosevelt won a close race. He was now the governor of New York and was one of the most powerful politicians in the country. That same year, 1898, the Republicans held on to Congress. It was a national affirmation of McKinley's imperialist policies. To many, Roosevelt was on an inevitable path to the White House. But not everyone was happy about it. William Randolph Hearst had loudly supported the war and promoted Roosevelt because it sold his papers, but he lamented that he didn't parlay his support into political gain. Hearst was embittered and now called Roosevelt, quote, a prideless office seeker. He also wrote, quote, "I guess I'm a failure. I made the mistake of my life in not raising the cowboy regiment I had in mind before Roosevelt raised his. I really believed I brought on the war, but I failed to score in the war. I had my chance and failed to grab it." With the midterm victories, McKinley had wind in his sails. He pushed to get the final treaty with Spain signed. Spain was in a very weak position, given its poor performance in the war. Although Madrid used a few delaying tactics, by November 28th it couldn't ignore reality any longer. The Spanish government finally accepted America's demands. According to the treaty, Spain ceded Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. The United States paid Spain an extra $20 million for the Philippines. Cuba would become independent, although the United States would later pass the Platt Amendment, which gave it the right of intervention on the island. This revoked the previous assurances that Cuba would truly be independent. Although the Filipinos wished to be treated as equals, they were not permitted a say in treaty negotiations. The Constitution expressly gives the Senate the right to approve or reject treaties with foreign nations. The president can negotiate them, but the Senate has the final say. McKinley was too politically savvy to leave that to chance. He actively participated in the ratification process. McKinley's choice a few months earlier of including 3 senators in the commission, one of whom was a Democrat, was a shrewd move, as it gave the treaty bipartisan credibility. Still, he needed 2/3 of the Senate to vote for ratification, meaning they needed some Democrats on board. Weeks of politicking ensued. Promises were made. Senators were told that they could have their friends appointed to high places. It was all the ugly political stuff that most people don't want to see. Supporters of the treaty needed to do all of it because there was significant opposition. Debate was fierce. To anti-imperialists, the treaty signified America's transformation from a republic to an empire. This was the republic's last stand. Republican Senator George Hoar declared, quote, "This treaty will make us a vulgar, commonplace empire, controlling subject races and vassal states, in which one class must forever rule, and other classes must forever obey." Hoar insisted that, quote, "If we take the Philippines under the Treaty of Peace, the downfall of the American Republic will date from the administration of William McKinley." But others, like Republican Senator Newt Nelson, countered that America had to ratify the treaty because its role was changing. It was now a world power, and even powerful republics had certain duties. Quote, "Providence has given the United States the duty of extending Christian civilization. We come as ministering angels, not despots." And Theodore Roosevelt made clear his views on those who opposed the treaty. Quote, "To propose to ratify the treaty would be a crime not only against America, but against civilization. It is difficult for me to speak with moderation of such men as Hoar. They are little better than traitors." The nation was in suspense. No one knew what the outcome would be. In a sense, the senators were deciding between two very different futures for the United States. As I alluded to earlier, it takes 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty. On February 6, 1899, the vote occurred. The treaty passed by 2 votes. The United States now possessed Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, plus Hawaii, which it had annexed earlier, and now had virtual control over Cuba. In a matter of months, it now had an empire controlling over 11 million new people. A couple of votes determined the fate of 11 million. During this time, things were falling apart between the United States and the Philippines. By now, the Filipinos realized that they were being tossed around as a pawn between two great powers. For years, they had struggled against the Spanish in the hopes of attaining independence. To those leading the Filipino rebellion, it would be all for nothing if control from Madrid was replaced by control from Washington. Even more galling was the fact that, in their eyes, they had been betrayed by an ally, a nation they had trusted and had worked with in the hopes of ridding their nation of Spanish rule. And not just any nation, but the United States of America, a republic. If any nation understood what it meant to fight for independence, a colonial empire, it should have been the United States. The Americans began preparing to rule the islands. The previous August, in 1898, General Otis had ordered Aguinaldo to withdraw from Manila, which he did. But Aguinaldo wasn't finished. He had been exiled before by the Spanish and had returned. This time, he was using his time to consolidate his control over the rest of the Philippines. Aguinaldo had a bold plan. He was preparing for war, an asymmetric war between the Philippines and the United States, between a group of islands against one of the world's mightiest rising powers. And he had a considerable number of men, about 80 to 100,000 Filipinos. Meanwhile, American soldiers in Manila were doing him a favor. They were wearing out their welcome. They were being obnoxious and offensive. They referred to the Filipinos with the same 6-letter word beginning with the letter N that were being used on African Americans back at home. And the Americans were receiving intelligence that told them the Filipinos were up to something. General Otis knew that he had a potential war to fight. On November 1898, he wired back to Washington, quote, "Prudence dictates that all troops here and soon to be arrived be retained. Aguinaldo is ambitious, acting with unscrupulous members of cabinet and advisers, cries independence, secretly assert Americans must be driven out, necessary to maintain adequate force to meet possible emergencies." Otis sent word back to Washington that he needed 25,000 troops and wanted permission to capture territory beyond Manila. Although the peace treaty hadn't been ratified yet, President McKinley wanted to assert American rule. He declared that the U.S. controlled all the Philippine Islands. Then, on December 21, 1898, McKinley issued a proclamation of benevolent assimilation, establishing military rule in the Philippines. By the end of December 1898, Otis was ordered to occupy all strategic points on the island possible before the insurgents get possession of them. To Aguinaldo, this was a declaration of war. He responded to McKinley's actions by saying, quote, "My nation cannot refrain indifferent in view of such a violation and aggressive seizure of its territory by a nation which has arrogated to itself the title of champion of oppressed nations. My government is disposed to open hostilities if the American troops attempt to take forcible possession. President McKinley was a shrewd politician, a man with far more backbone than portrayed. But he also seemed to have an optimistic view of the situation. He seemed to think that the Filipinos would accept rule with little complaint, perhaps even with gratitude. He seemed to be unaware that he was provoking an inevitable war with the Filipinos. In January 1899, he wrote to General Otis that he was, quote, desirous that conflict be avoided. They will come to see our benevolent purpose and recognize that before we can give their people good government, our sovereignty must be complete and unquestioned. McKinley did know that his actions were provoking controversy and criticism. He knew what the anti-imperialists were saying, so he decided to respond to them. In February 1899, McKinley gave a major speech in Boston, Massachusetts, where he defended his administration's actions in the Philippines. He said that the choice was, quote, either Spain or the United States in the Philippines, and that the U.S. was concerned only about, quote, the welfare and happiness of the rights of the inhabitants of the Philippine Islands. He insisted that, quote, no imperial designs lurk in the American mind. They are alien to American sentiment, thought, and purpose. He said that, quote, every red drop, whether from the veins of an American soldier or a misguided Filipino, is anguish to my heart. He looked forward to the Filipinos as, quote, a people redeemed from savage indolence and habits, devoted to the arts of peace, in touch with commerce and trade of all nations, enjoying the blessings of freedom, of civil and religious liberty, and whose children and children's children shall for ages hence bless the American Republic, because it emancipated and redeemed their fatherland and set them in the pathway of the world's best civilization. The anti-imperialists weren't convinced, and they continued to argue that America's moral character as a republic was at stake. Anti-war activist Carl Schurz gave a speech in Chicago appealing to his nation's sense of exceptionalism. Quote, if this democracy, after all the intoxication of triumph and war, deliberately resists the temptation of conquest, it will achieve the grandest triumph of the democratic idea that history knows of. It will give the government of, for, and by the people a prestige it never before possessed. It will render the cause of civilization throughout the world a service without parallel. It will put its detractors to shame, and its voice will be heard in the Council of Nations with sincere respect and more deference than ever. The American people, having given proof of their strength and also of their honesty and wisdom, will stand infinitely mightier before the world than any number of subjugated vassals could make them. Is this not genuine glory? Is not this true patriotism? Let us raise high the flag of our country, not as an emblem of reckless adventure and greedy conquest, of betrayed professions and broken pledges, of criminal aggressions and arbitrary rule over the subject populations, but the old, the true flag, the flag of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, the flag of the government of, for, and by the people, the flag of national faith held sacred and of national honor unsullied, the flag of human rights and of good example to all nations, the flag of true civilization, peace, and goodwill to all men. Back in the Philippines, both sides dug in their heels preparing for war. It was one of those moments when time stood still, when everyone was waiting for the big event. The entire situation was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. On the evening of February 4th, 1899, it happened. That night, Private William W. Grayson, a sentry of the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and 2 other men were on patrol duty when they encountered a small group of Filipino soldiers. According to Grayson, he ordered the group to halt. Instead, he heard them cock their rifles. In response, Grayson and his 2 colleagues opened fire. 2 Filipino soldiers were killed. To this day, many Filipino historians insist that the 2 soldiers were unarmed. The news that shots were fired spread like wildfire. Now, Aguinaldo still hoped to avoid war. He knew he was taking an enormous risk going to war with the Americans. Right after the shooting, he sent a message to General Otis declaring the incident an accident and calling for hostilities to cease. Perhaps at this moment, war could have been delayed. but Otis wasn't as dedicated to peace. He responded that the, quote, fighting having begun must go on to the grim end. The day after Grayson opened fire, General Arthur MacArthur ordered his troops to advance against the Filipinos, beginning a full-scale armed clash. The Philippine-American War had begun. The Filipinos knew they faced a stronger enemy. How much stronger? Well, think of it this way. Their arsenal consisted mainly of bows, arrows, knives, and spears. These were the weapons they had as they faced a first-class world power with guns and cannon. The Americans' technological advantage was almost laughable, but the Filipinos had a few things on their side. They were on their own turf, and they had almost 100,000 men. And they turned to the strategy that made the most sense in these situations: guerrilla warfare. And like most such wars, it was brutal. The calculus of guerrilla war makes it almost impossible for both sides to avoid brutality. This was the type of war Teddy Roosevelt said was the most honorable, a war against what Westerners considered, quote, the savages. To counter guerrilla tactics, the Americans undertook a familiar policy. They separated the civilian population from the Filipino rebels in some areas and placed them into internment camps. Many of these camps were in horrible conditions, where disease and malnourishment were rampant. Just 1 year before, the Americans were outraged by these same atrocities committed by the Spanish. It's funny what a difference a year makes. If you were a Filipino from the provinces of Batangas or Laguna, you and everyone you knew were tossed into the camps. Literally whole provinces were moved into prisons. And this wasn't limited to combatants. Civilian Filipinos were often arrested, interrogated, tortured, and executed. The most infamous type of torture was the water cure. Imagine a group of men overpowering you, holding you down, clamping your nose with pincers, and shoving a funnel into your mouth and your throat. Then they'd turn on the water. It would pour into your system. Your stomach would be filled with water, and the water would keep going. You would start flailing around in a panic as your breathing was closed off. You felt the agony of suffocation, as well as the agony of your stomach being filled on the verge of bursting with water. One American soldier described it in the following terms, quote, "A man is thrown down on his back, and 3 or 4 men sit or stand on his arms and legs and hold him down. He is simply held down, and then water is poured onto his face, down his throat and nose from a jar, and that is kept until the man gives some sign or becomes unconscious. And when he becomes unconscious, he is simply rolled aside. They were rolled aside rudely, so that water was expelled. A man suffers tremendously, there is no doubt about it. His sufferings must be that of a man who is drowning but cannot drown." These men would basically be drowned, but not to the point of death, then released. But once they recovered, they would be made to suffer the same thing over and over again. The reality is that in situations like these, brutality goes both ways. According to Filipino historian Teodoro Aguinaldo, the Filipino guerrillas could match or even exceed American brutality on prisoners of war. American POWs were rounded up. Their ears were cut off, as were their noses. As they crumpled in agony, the Filipinos would dump salt on their wounds. Some Americans met the gruesome fate of being buried alive. And sometimes the torture of Americans included the use of fire ants. According to one account, quote, "A detachment marching through Leyte found an American who had disappeared a short time before, crucified, head down. His abdominal wall had been carefully opened so that his intestines might hang down in his face. Another prisoner, found on the same trip, had been buried in the ground with only his head projecting. His mouth had been propped open with a stick, a trail of sugar laid to it through the forest, and had a handful thrown into it. Millions of ants had done the rest." One correspondent in Manila for the Philadelphia Ledger described the war as the following, quote, "Our men, talking about the Americans, have been relentless, have killed to exterminate men, women, children, prisoners, captives, active insurgents, and suspected people, from lads of 10 and up. the idea prevailing that the Filipino, as such, was little better than a dog, a noisome reptile in some instances, whose best disposition was the rubbish heap. It is not civilized warfare, but we are not dealing with civilized people. The only thing they know and fear is force, violence, and brutality, and we will give it to them. The Filipinos clearly had a military objective: force the Americans off the island. But their goal also involved American domestic politics. It was simple: bog the Americans down in an endless and horrible quagmire. This, they believed, would sour the American public on the war. Perhaps it could even lead to President McKinley's defeat in his 1900 re-election campaign. It was no different than the American strategy during their Revolutionary War: make the war so painful for the British that support for the war in the Parliament and among the broader population would collapse and lead to American independence. And it worked. It was the same strategy that the Confederacy tried against Lincoln in the Civil War, and it didn't work. And also the same strategy that the North Vietnamese did against the Americans in the 1960s and 70s. By 1900, the Filipinos had succeeded in making the war a substantial burden for the Americans. McKinley had escalated America's troop presence in the Philippines to about 70,000. And with his re-election campaign in full swing, the 1900 presidential election would truly be a referendum on McKinley's imperialist policies. The American public heard reports of atrocities. This fueled anti-imperialists all the more. It was one thing to be against the war in theory, but now they could point to the actual miseries of the war, the things that no one wants to hear about, the civilians being killed, the torture being inflicted. But if you think the imperialists back down, think again. The new New York governor, Theodore Roosevelt, doubled down and fully embraced his nationally recognized role as defender of imperialism. And he, as well as other imperialists, turned the tables on the anti-war crowd, accusing them of aiding the enemy and of committing treason. In Roosevelt's words, quote, "As for those in our own country who encourage the foe, we can afford contemptuously to disregard them, but it must be remembered that their utterances are not saved from being treasonable, rather merely by the fact that they are despicable." But remember, for Roosevelt, this was more than just about one war. This whole project had a much larger goal: fundamentally altering America's role in the world, getting America to take its place in the world as a true superpower. And Roosevelt and his close friend Senator Lodge knew just how to do it, putting a true imperialist in the White House. And the most famous imperialist in the nation was Theodore Roosevelt. Both he and Lodge had planned this for years. In 1899, Lodge had written to Roosevelt that he had, quote, "two great desires, one to see my country succeed in these vast problems and emerge gloriously on the great world stage where she has set her conquering foot. The other is to make you president, and I think it can be done." With his fellow Republican McKinley in office, Roosevelt would have to wait until 1904 when McKinley would be retiring. But Lodge was considering how best to position his friend for the White House, and he came up with an idea that at the time seemed risky. Lodge believed that the best route for Roosevelt was to become McKinley's vice president. As fate would have it, McKinley's vice president, Garrett Hobart, had died in office at the end of 1899, leaving the position vacant. If Roosevelt was chosen as vice president in 1900 and elected, he might be well positioned to run in 1904 as McKinley's successor. Now, this might not seem surprising now. Vice presidents are usually logical candidates for the top job. Ever since Nixon served as Eisenhower's vice president and ran to succeed him in 1960, several vice presidents have gotten the nomination, like George H.W. Bush and Al Gore. But that wasn't always the case in American history. If you look up the list of vice presidents, you'll find a lot of names that you probably won't recognize, like Richard Johnson, Henry Wilson, and Levi Morton. Vice presidents were rarely successful at getting the nomination during the 19th centuries. That usually happened to governors or generals. And only 3 vice presidents out of 25 had been elected straight from the presidency up till that point. The other vice presidents who attained the White House came there through death or the assassination of the president. So Roosevelt wasn't convinced that the vice presidency was the best route. Not to mention, it was also a very boring job, with few actual duties and far less powerful than being governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt was a man of action. The vice presidency would be a waste of his talents. As I said earlier, Roosevelt was a man of destiny. The stars aligned for Roosevelt far better than he or Lodge could have possibly planned. The vice presidency remained vacant. Roosevelt was governor of New York. But since he was a reformer, someone who shook up the status quo, he made powerful enemies in his own party. One of them was New York Party boss Tom Platt. Although he supported him for governor in 1898, he now wanted him out of New York and irrelevant. In his eyes, the one place guaranteed to make anyone irrelevant was the vice presidency. When the 1900 Republican Convention commenced, Platt engineered Roosevelt's nomination to the ticket as President McKinley's running mate. Platt must have felt pretty clever. He could now rule New York in peace. But in doing so, Platt did more to put Roosevelt on the path to the presidency than he could have imagined. There are lots of quotes that sum up the futility of the vice presidency. Our first VP, John Adams, once said while he was in office that he was, quote, nothing, but I may be everything. A vice president might be a useless afterthought for the time being, but he might become everything if for some reason something happened to the president. McKinley's top political aide, Mark Hanna, was not a fan of Roosevelt's and realized what Platt had done. Believing that McKinley and Roosevelt would be elected, Platt said, quote, there's only one life between that madman and the presidency. Regardless of these machinations, the 1900 election was in full swing. The Democrats nominated McKinley's previous opponent in 1896, William Jennings Bryan, who traveled around the country attacking McKinley's imperialist policies. He attacked imperialism in moral terms, saying, quote, it was God himself who placed in every human heart the love of liberty. He never made a race so low on the scale of civilization or intelligence that it would welcome a foreign master. Bryan talked about the message imperialism was sending to the world when he said, quote, we cannot set a high and honorable example for the emulation of mankind while we roam the world like beasts of prey seeking whom we may devour. Bryan appealed to American values when he said, quote, can it be our duty to kill those who, following the example of our forefathers, love liberty well enough to fight for it? While McKinley played a passive role during the campaign, Roosevelt took the campaign trail, defending the administration and attacking Bryan. He referred to Bryan's voters as, quote, all the lunatics, all the idiots, all the knaves, all the cowards, and all the honest people who were slow-witted. One historian notes a fascinating incident in which some of Aguinaldo's associates actually reached out to Bryan to cooperate for the 1900 election. They proposed to announce that they would stop fighting if Bryan won. Bryan was smart enough to scotch the deal, knowing how bad it would look like if he collaborated with the enemy. The incident shows us that foreign collusion is no new thing. The American people had a choice. They had heard the arguments between the imperialists and the anti-imperialists, between those who felt that it was in America's best interests, and perhaps the world's, to take its place as a world power and acquire colonies, and those who feared that such an expansion would destroy the American experiment. They had heard the news of the atrocities in the Philippines, but they also knew that their nation was enjoying success that it had never known before. It had defeated Spain, one of the old world's great empires. It now had possessions across the planet. Although they paled in comparison to European colonial possessions, it was certainly in a better strategic position. American victories on the world stage had been intoxicating. McKinley was popular, and his running mate, Theodore Roosevelt, was like a national action hero. The conflict in the Philippines wasn't going to spoil the party. That fall, the McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won in a landslide. It was a national vindication for the imperialists, especially one of their own, Theodore Roosevelt, who was now Vice President of the United States. It was a devastating defeat, not only for the anti-imperialists, but for the Filipino insurgents. William McKinley was at the top of his career, but his close friend, Mark Hanna, was worried that TR was now a heartbeat away from the presidency. After McKinley was sworn in for his second term, McKinley told him, quote, your duty to the country is to live for 4 years from next March. As McKinley began his second term, he looked towards ending the Philippine Rebellion and consolidating American rule on the islands. He hoped to implement a new phase, the institution of civilian government in the Philippines. For that, he reached out to a portly judge from the U.S. Court of Appeals in Cincinnati, William Howard Taft. Taft had a distinguished legal career, serving as the nation's Solicitor General and as a federal judge. McKinley was now asking him to govern a nation he knew little about on the other side of the world. The president met with Taft, formally offering him the office of governor of the Philippines. Taft was shocked. He had never considered the job. Anyone that knew Taft knew that his dream was to be on the United States Supreme Court. Knowing this, McKinley promised him that if he accepted the position in the Philippines, he would appoint him to the Supreme Court the next time an opportunity arose. That clinched it for Taft, who accepted. The job of pacifying a former enemy and establishing its government now fell to a judge from Ohio. By then, the tide was turning in favor of the United States. While guerrilla tactics can be effective, you can only do so much with spears and knives in the age of steam power and machine guns. General Arthur MacArthur, father of future General Douglas MacArthur, was in charge of the war effort, and he sensed an opportunity to end the war. He successfully instituted fierce anti-guerrilla measures. In March 1901, as McKinley was sworn into his second term, the Americans inflicted a major blow on the Filipinos. Brigadier General Frederick Funston captured Aguinaldo alive. The Filipinos were leaderless. While in prison, Aguinaldo gave in to American pressure and called for an end to the fighting. He said, quote, "There has been enough blood, enough tears, enough desolation. I cannot refuse to heed the voice of the people longing for peace, nor the lamentations of thousands of families yearning to see their dear loved ones enjoying the liberty and the promised generosity of the great American nation. By acknowledging and accepting the sovereignty of the United States throughout the Philippine archipelago, as I do now, and without reservation whatsoever, I believe that I am serving thee, my beloved country." Large-scale Filipino resistance began melting away. On July 1901, McKinley declared the end of military rule over the Philippines and the establishment of a civilian government led by Taft. That didn't stop the last remaining holdouts. Low-level fighting in the Philippines continued. In one notorious incident in September 1901, a group of civilian townspeople in Balanga on the island of Samar rose up against their occupiers, the U.S. Army's 9th Infantry Regiment. As the Americans were eating their breakfast and unaware of any threat, the Filipinos confiscated some weapons and began shooting at them. Some took knives and hacked them to death. Several Americans fought back using kitchen utensils. 48 Americans were killed. The United States responded without mercy. They marched to the island of Samar and destroyed everything they could find. They burned down homes and shot people indiscriminately. They surrounded the island and basically blockaded anything from coming in, hoping to starve the population. This whole incident is known as the Balanga Massacre. But those who support the American side of things refer to the townspeople's initial attack as the massacre, while those who support the Filipino side refer to the American response as the massacre. Historians still debate the death toll from the American response. You can literally find estimates ranging from 2,000 to 50,000. Even if the war was drawing to a close, the fighting remained brutal and bloody. Back in the United States, President McKinley was at the height of his popularity. He was the first president to be re-elected in almost 3 decades. He was seen as the successful architect of a new American empire. Though the Philippine War was ugly, his nation was prospering overall and could claim a stronger presence throughout the world. In September of 1901, he visited Buffalo, New York for the World's Fair, that year known as the Pan American Exposition. The exposition made for a fascinating contrast to events in the Philippines. While Americans and Filipinos were employing violent measures that stretched the boundaries of civilization, the fair took place to showcase the progress of civilization. For most Americans, the events happening across the world might as well have been on another planet. But violence found its way to this joyous celebration of human achievement. On the afternoon of September 6, 1901, President McKinley was greeting guests in a concert hall. A 28-year-old man named Leon Chilgas, a former steelworker and anarchist, approached the president. Chilgas's hand was wrapped with a handkerchief, which concealed a revolver. He raised up his hand to McKinley as if to greet him. Instead, he fired 2 shots into the president's abdomen. McKinley staggered back in shock. Witnesses gasped and shrieked in horror. Pandemonium erupted. When the people in the immediate vicinity realized what had happened, they tackled Chilgas and began pummeling him. McKinley was shocked by the shooting, but when he saw the crowd attacking his assailant, he took pity on him and ordered them to stop. As blood flowed from his wounds, the president then thought of his wife Ida. As an invalid, her health was quite precarious. He worried that the shock of the shooting might threaten her health. Turning to his aide, George Cartellieu, McKinley said, quote, "Be careful how you tell her. Oh, be careful." Initially, there was much optimism that McKinley would survive. Over the next few days, he seemed to be recovering and in a relaxed mood. But soon, a gangrene infection set in. That's ultimately what did him in. McKinley held on for another week, but on September 13th, he collapsed. Early morning the following day, he died. He was 58 years old. The nation was shocked at McKinley's assassination. As his coffin was lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda, 100,000 mourners filed past it to pay their respects. Outrage at the president's death spread throughout the nation. In less than 2 months, his assassin was tried, found guilty, and executed by the electric chair. His body was then doused in acid to dissolve it. Many Americans felt that they had lost a national hero. But at the same time, another hero, just as, if not more popular, had been elevated to the White House. Theodore Roosevelt was now the 26th President of the United States. It was one of the great ironies in history. Roosevelt was placed on the ticket as a way to get him out of New York and into a position of irrelevance. Instead, it inadvertently positioned him to attain the highest office in the land. I know of no other situation when someone was placed in the vice presidency to get rid of him. Maybe it happened, I just don't know about it. It seems to have been relatively rare in history. Vice presidents are chosen more to balance the national ticket and to broaden support. And if that's the case, it was sheer irony that it would happen just before the assassination of a president. It was a grievous blow for anti-imperialists. They were no fans of William McKinley, but for many of them, Theodore Roosevelt was a madman, and yet now he was the President of the United States. Upon being sworn in, Roosevelt pledged to, quote, "continue absolutely unbroken the policy of President McKinley for the peace, prosperity, and honor of our beloved country." By 1902, the United States was, for all practical effect, victorious in the Philippines. The casualty numbers from the war vary significantly. The U.S. State Department says that 4,200 Americans and over 20,000 Filipino combatants were killed. The estimated number of civilian Filipino deaths range from 34,000 to several hundred thousand. One Filipino historian claims that the number is over 1 million. Taft would go on to serve as the governor of the Philippines from July 1901 to December 1903. Although he believed that the Filipinos weren't ready for independence, he hoped to prepare them for self-government. He hoped to end the heavy-handedness of the American occupation, so he insisted that his administration treat the Filipinos as equals and prevented racial segregation at official events. Taft worked hard to ensure that there was no hint of white supremacy in his government and pledged, quote, to banish this idea from their minds. Historians consider Taft's time in the Philippines as a success and critical to normalizing the Filipino-American relationship. In subsequent years, the United States facilitated the creation of a Philippine legislature and the elections to determine who sat in it. In 1916, the United States passed the Philippine Autonomy Act, which expressed America's commitment to eventual Philippine independence. In 1934, the American Congress passed a bill promising Philippine independence by 1946. Although the Japanese occupied the Philippines during World War II, the United States liberated it and granted it independence, as promised in 1946. The United States and the Philippines remained close allies during the Cold War and beyond. Generally speaking, the Philippines have been strongly supportive of the United States. A Pew Research poll in 2014 found that in a survey of 44 countries, the Philippines was the most pro-American country in the world, with 92% of respondents expressing a favorable view of the United States. To give you a frame of reference, that number was 84% for Israel, 75% for France, and 51% for Germany. Most Filipinos remain grateful for America's role in liberating them from the Japanese during World War II. The Philippine-American War may appear in their history textbooks, but its impact on the national memory has faded. In the United States, the war has all been but forgotten. 1898 was a critical year in American history. It was the year that America went from looking inward to looking outward. It began to ask questions of itself that it rarely had before. Should America become an empire? Was an empire consistent with our founding principles? Most studies of the war seem to assume America as the aggressor, as the villain. They talk about the false pretexts that led to the war, the destruction of the Maine, the fake news propagated by William Randolph Hearst. I'm not so sure that's the entire story. It completely ignores Spain's own culpability in the conflict. Spain's rule over its colonies was harsh and autocratic. The Cubans and Filipinos rebelled against Spain without American involvement. It is completely understandable that America would take an interest in Cuba just 90 miles away from its shores. Europeans had a long history of using instability as a pretext to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. Presidents Cleveland and McKinley both gave Spain multiple chances to seek some resolution to the issue. When it comes to the destruction of the U.S. Maine, the initial reports indicated the explosion came from the outside. It was wholly reasonable for the American people to be outraged, and McKinley had spent months attempting to avoid war, giving Spain multiple chances for a settlement. At least one historian, Lewis Gould, believes that the emphasis on yellow journalism throughout the war is exaggerated. While Hearst certainly sensationalized reports about the war, it isn't clear how influential they were. I also think that American critics fail to take into account the fact that the Americans had a real concern that if it didn't take over other territories, including the Philippines, that other nations far less dedicated to the rights of man would have filled in the void. It was a very real possibility that Germany or Japan would take over the Philippines if the Americans didn't. And for America, it was an agonizing choice. Some argue that this argument, that if we don't take them over, someone else will, has been used to justify every single act of imperialism. That might be true, but to ignore it, I think, is to ignore a real dilemma that international statesmen have to face. No nation in history has risen to the status as a world power with more ambivalence as the United States. Few seem to ever account for the dilemma that powerful nations must face, often between bad and worst options. With all that said, a real change happened in America during this time. And that change occurred in large part because of the actions of two men, Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley. Whatever role Spain played in its own demise, it is still fair to examine Roosevelt and McKinley's roles in this story. The legendary writer Mark Twain was one of America's most prominent anti-imperialists and an outspoken critic of the Philippine-American War. He minced no words when it came to Theodore Roosevelt, calling him, quote, the most formidable disaster that has befallen the country since the Civil War. But he admitted that, quote, the vast mass of the country loves him, is frantically fond of him, even idolizes him. To this day, most Americans, historians included, consider Roosevelt one of the greatest of American presidents. Just a few years after he died in 1919, it was decided that he would be included in Mount Rushmore's pantheon of great presidents, along with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. Perhaps the greatest political consequence from the Spanish-American War was the rise of Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. Theodore Roosevelt would be reelected in 1904 and would serve almost the equivalent of 2 terms. In doing so, he became one of America's most popular presidents. He continued to flex America's muscle abroad, intervening in Latin America to ensure the creation of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt soon declared what would be called the Roosevelt Corollary, which made it the policy of the United States to intervene in conflicts between European nations and Latin American countries, rather than having the Europeans press their claims directly. It was an addendum to the Monroe Doctrine and a way for the United States to preempt European interference in the Western Hemisphere. To Roosevelt's critics, it was merely a euphemism for American imperialism. To his supporters, it was yet another example of America taking its rightful place in the world as a great power. He also built up America's navy and sent its White Fleet around the world as a show of strength. Many anti-imperialists fear that Roosevelt's rise to the presidency would fundamentally transform America into a true empire and maybe even get America embroiled in wars abroad. They feared that the war with the Philippines was just a mere prelude to what was to come. But events have a way of surprising us. Throughout his tenure as president, Roosevelt achieved several notable triumphs, not on the battlefield, but in the halls of diplomacy. He successfully mediated a crisis between Venezuela and several European powers in 1903, and in another crisis between France and Germany in 1906. And he negotiated the treaty to end the war between Japan and Russia. For the latter, he became the first American president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. One can imagine how the anti-war activists felt about that, considering they saw Roosevelt as just to the right of Attila the Hun. Roosevelt's emergence as a force for peace is yet further proof that political figures often act in ways we least expect. It may be a bit much to claim that Roosevelt was the end of the Republic, as the anti-imperialists did. But he did define a muscular foreign policy that would go on to characterize the United States' foreign policy throughout the rest of the 20th century. For the first century of its existence, the United States largely adhered to the policy of non-intervention that George Washington discussed in his farewell address. Standing armies and permanent alliances were considered things to be avoided, things that threatened our existence as a nation. The United States would not fully shed this policy until the start of the Cold War, when America committed itself to a permanent alliance with the Europeans through NATO. But that didn't happen overnight. From the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, more and more Americans began to accept that the United States had an interest in playing a greater role in the world. Franklin D. Roosevelt contributed to this in the 1940s, especially with the creation of the United Nations. Before him, Woodrow Wilson made his contribution as well, with his 14 points in the creation of the League of Nations. Wilson expressed America's role largely in moral terms. But Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to truly embrace an interventionist America with a major global leadership role, and to do so with almost no reluctance. His popularity with the American people, who thrilled to his heroics in a foreign war, lent prestige and legitimacy to the idea of an active America on the world stage. America's participation in the United Nations in 1945 and in NATO in 1947 didn't happen in a vacuum. The institutionalization of American power abroad was the culmination of a process that Theodore Roosevelt laid the foundation for. With thousands of American soldiers stationed abroad, and with the United States possessing the most powerful military in the world today, it appears that Roosevelt's vision for his nation has come to pass. Although Roosevelt could have run for re-election in 1908, he decided that it was time to retire. Instead, he endorsed his Secretary of War and the former governor of Philippines, William Howard Taft. In 1908, Taft defeated William Jennings Bryan, President McKinley's former opponent, to become the 27th President of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt remains the central figure in this drama, but he was far from alone. History had tasked William McKinley to preside over America's first great wave of international expansion. He also had the misfortune of serving before one of the most colorful and fascinating presidents in American history. This ensured that McKinley would be seen merely as a prelude to a far more activist president. Though he served at the turn of the century, he would be perceived as more of a 19th century figure than a 20th century one. It was a great irony. McKinley's war and his appointment of Theodore Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy inadvertently put Roosevelt on the path to the White House, and it would ruin his own historical reputation. Even worse, McKinley has been judged by historians to be a weak president, an empty vessel, who allowed business interests to lead him into a war with Spain. But this isn't entirely fair. From the research I've done, William McKinley was no prelude, nor was he a puppet. He was a man in charge of his administration who had clear objectives and ran the war effort with great competence. He was also an assertive chief executive, making the most of the latest communication methods to run the war and involving himself in the ratification of the treaty that ended it. And he had no problem flexing America's power abroad. In doing so, he set several precedents. This included requesting authorization to use force from Congress without a declaration of war, and justifying a war based on humanitarian reasons. Under McKinley, the United States came to rule millions of people thousands of miles away. It was by no means the equivalent of what the Europeans had done, taking over massive empires like India, but it was a symbolic moment. A moment when the world realized that power was shifting away from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere. The great irony of McKinley's presidency is that he didn't seek to build such an empire. He was reluctant to go to war and reluctant to conquer foreign territories. If Roosevelt was a true imperialist, McKinley was a reticent one. But when it was all said and done, McKinley ultimately chose the course of expansion. It appears he did so, not for the sake of national glory, like Roosevelt and Lodge, but because of a paternal sense of altruism, the desire to help the Cubans and the Filipinos. Regardless of the motives, the result was the same. America made its presence felt in the world. But in doing so, America and the Philippines suffered consequences unforeseen and unintended. Some have described the Korean War in the 1950s as America's forgotten war. I think there's a fair case for saying that that title should go to the war against the Philippines. It almost stands out as an anomaly. It was a bloody and painful war, but it left very little discernible imprint on the American memory. It was hotly debated across the country, but you get the strange sense that it didn't really change the American landscape. And for a war that has the reputation of being quite gruesome, it appears to have caused little trauma to the nation or to the U.S. military. You hear about the lost generation of European soldiers after World War I. You hear about the American soldiers returning from Vietnam and getting attacked and spat on. You hear about the soldiers returning from Iraq who struggle today with PTSD. But you don't hear much about the veterans from the Philippine American War, nor do you sense much in the way of a national trauma. Perhaps it's because of that old adage that history is written by the victors. America won the war. No matter how ugly the war was, the United States got what it wanted. Sometimes winning can paper over a lot of problems. But this does not change the reality of what happened. The war may not have affected most Americans, but it affected those who lived it. It affected the more than 100,000 American soldiers who went to a far-off nation on the other side of the world, who found themselves chasing guerrillas in the wet jungles of Southeast Asia. It affected thousands of Filipinos who spent years fighting for independence against one nation, only to see their efforts culminate in subjugation to an even more powerful nation. It affected those tens or hundreds of thousands of Philippine civilians, men, women, and children, many of whom saw their homes burned to the ground and were rounded up and killed indiscriminately. It affected soldiers who felt compelled to torture and kill each other in the most horrific ways possible. For me, this is an especially difficult subject because I am a proud American and also a proud American of Filipino descent. As I said earlier, Filipinos remain largely appreciative of what America has done for the Philippines, especially during the liberation from the Japanese in World War II. They celebrate Douglas MacArthur for his role in that effort. They even have a memorial dedicated to him. Whatever can be said about the Philippine-American War, nothing can take away from the fact that thousands of Americans gave their lives to free the Filipinos against the Japanese Empire. Nonetheless, the baggage of the Philippine-American War remains. It is taught in the Philippine history books for students. It reminds Filipinos that though America has done so much for their nation, it is not immune to the temptations that other great powers experience. Two things stick out to me about the war. The first is that it seems to have been based largely on a misunderstanding. The question remains whether Admiral Dewey promised Aguinaldo Philippine independence. The answer to this question affects, to some extent, America's honor in its conduct in the Philippines. and it's a question we will likely never answer. Yet it testifies to the consequences of confusion and misinformation. Second, when William McKinley decided to civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, he did something that he likely did not intend to do. He made war inevitable, and not just a war, but a ruthless guerrilla war. This is testament to the fact that good intentions, even done reluctantly, can lead to unintended consequences. Indeed, this war shows just how thin the line is between civilization and barbarism. McKinley and Roosevelt went to war in 1898, in part hoping to bring what they considered a savage race to civilization. But an unexpected and cruel war would call into question which side was truly civilized. In the 21st century, America remains the world's sole superpower, and its presidents are tempted to intervene abroad time and time again. Whenever that temptation comes, our presidents would do well to remember just how thin that line is. This American President is produced by myself, Richard Lim, and Michael Neal. The music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks again to the National History Club. For more information, please visit www.nationalhistoryclub.org. We want to say a special thanks to our Patreon supporters. You too can support us by going to patreon.com/thisamericanpresident and give any amount you choose per episode that we release. This helps us keep our podcast up and running and improves the quality of our episodes. If you like what you've been hearing, you can also help us by sharing an episode on Twitter or Facebook. Make sure you subscribe to us on iTunes and get notifications on new episodes, and please leave us a review. We recently hit a milestone of 40,000 downloads, and we just want to thank all of our listeners. This was something we're very excited about. And this episode concludes our series on expansionism in American history. The first episode being on the Louisiana Purchase, called The Art of the Steal. And we had 2 episodes on President James Polk, called The Great American Conqueror. And we just had these 2 episodes on the Spanish-American War, Will and Ted's Imperial Adventure. We really enjoyed producing these episodes, and we're also excited about our future episodes that we have lined up. We have interviews lined up with different people, and we are also starting a series on the Cold War that will look at the Yalta Conference and at President Truman and Eisenhower and the other presidents that served during that time. So stay tuned for future episodes, and thank you so much for your support. I'm Richard Lim. We're back next time with more on This American President.